The following video contains spoilers for both Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. At some point, I'll be talking about the very end of the story, so consider yourself warned. Disney's, EA's, Respawn's Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order was a game that was released in 2019 that I thoroughly enjoyed. I enjoyed it so much that I played it all the way through the end. You might not think this is a big deal at all, but I'm the type of person who has no problem putting a game down for good if I'm not having a good time. I rarely feel compelled to complete a game just for the sake of completing it. So actually finishing Fallen Order is high praise in my book. Naturally, I was interested in playing the sequel, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, when it arrived in April of 2023. However, I did not play Star Wars Jedi Survivor upon its initial release in April of 2023, mostly because of the general consensus that it was a game that came out hot and was mired with technical problems and performance issues on all platforms. However, since 2023 was an absolutely loaded year for video game releases, I didn't mind waiting a little bit for Jedi Survivor to get patched and fixed. So 4 months after its initial release, Respawn put out a big patch for Jedi Survivor that got the console versions of the game running at a mostly stable 60 FPS. So the time felt right to finally jump in and check it out. Plus it was on sale. I played it, and like its predecessor, I saw it through to the end. So that means more high praise, right? Well, yes and no. The game is good. Really good, even. It feels great to play and is littered with moments of brilliance. But there are also a couple of glaring flaws that keep it from being truly great. The gameplay is rock solid, but starts to wear pretty thin during the last few hours, and I found myself getting a little salty and irritable the longer it went on. The main thing that kept me going at that point was to see the conclusion of the story. However, while the story is mostly strong, it unfortunately fumbles the bag toward the end in a pretty disappointing fashion. So yes, I finished Jedi Survivor, but despite having an enjoyable experience most of the time, I had a slightly sour taste in my mouth when it was all over. So I decided to do what any normal, well-adjusted person would do. Make a YouTube video essay to work through my feelings. I wanted to take a closer look at what worked and what didn't work during my playthrough. I walked away with some surprisingly strong opinions, and some takes, if you will. There are a lot of good things to say, but I also just have to talk about a few things that dampen the experience. So with all that being said, let's dive in. Star Wars Jedi Survivor does the thing that good sequels do. It takes the good parts of the first game and expands and improves upon them. Our hero Cal Kestis is back.
Hey, little guy.
Along with the rock-solid writing and performances. The gameplay foundation from the first game is back as well, but this time there's more lightsaber stances, force powers, and style options to really mold Cal into the playstyle that you want. The differences between the lightsaber stances significantly changes how you play, and it was very satisfying to find the combo that worked best for me. I went with the blaster and crossguard stances for most of the game, even though they weren't available until a certain part in the story. The combat in Fallen Order was frequently compared to Dark Souls, but when playing Jedi Survivor, I think the game is more comparable to Sekiro, specifically because of the emphasis on parrying and guarding, and the fact that you can't really increase stats or overlevel your character to get by a challenge. You have to engage in its combat system in order to succeed. I think this works really well for this type of action-adventure game and leads to many satisfying moments where you land a perfect parry and counter with a devastating execution move. When you get into the flow, Jedi Survivor is a blast to play. The story continues where the first one left off, and is mostly pretty good. I think that both of these games have a stronger narrative than some of the recent Star Wars shows, and even some of the movies. It's not as good as, say, Andor, but this is a completely decent entry in the Star Wars canon. Even though it's got stormtroopers, TIE fighters, lightsabers, and other familiar Star Wars stuff, the game rightly focuses on new characters, new planets, and other new ideas, which is something that Star Wars stories generally have a hard time doing. There are a few questionable things about the narrative that I'll get into later, but overall, it's a well-written and well-realized story. The game world of Jedi Survivor feels substantially bigger than it did in the first game. There are an enormous amount of areas to explore and collectibles to find. The main planet, Kobo, is absolutely massive and has a seemingly never-ending amount of stuff to find. When done right, this type of exploration-based gameplay is like crack to me, especially when there's a useful map included, which there is. Investigating unexplored areas on the map to find treasures, upgrades, skill points, optional bosses, and so on was generally a really good time, although I do have one little gripe with the exploration. Most of the items and chests you find are purely cosmetic upgrades. New hairstyles, new outfits, new colors and materials for your lightsaber and your droid, BD-1. There's also new parts to change the look of your lightsaber, and since the lightsaber has like 7 or 8 separate components, you'll find these little parts a lot. You might find a secret cave, fight a tough enemy, or solve an environmental puzzle, and your reward will be like a new grip for your lightsaber or something. I'm not saying that every item you find needs to be highly valuable, but getting a small 1/7 piece of a lightsaber that's barely perceivable during normal gameplay is beyond useless, and almost makes searching for secrets feel like wasted time. Here's the thing though, every now and then, maybe like 10% of the time, instead of a cosmetic reward, sometimes you get a permanent health or force upgrade, a skill point, or even an extra health stim. These upgrades are extremely useful and absolutely worth finding. So even though exploring a side area will often just net you a new beard for Cal or another lightsaber part, the fact that there's even a chance that you might get a new permanent upgrade means that I felt compelled to spend a considerable amount of time checking every corner of every area, just to make sure I didn't miss something important. This doesn't ruin the exploration by any means, and some might even call it good game design. But if you're not the kind of person who's into customizing the cosmetic stuff, then you'll likely find the exploration rewards to be a bit of a letdown. That being said, there were definitely a few customizations I was excited to get, specifically the hairstyles. I very much enjoyed making Cal look like a complete scumbag with a mullet and a handlebar mustache, especially since that look would carry over into the cutscenes. Cal would be in the middle of these big emotional moments in the story, while at the same time looking like the cousin of Joe Dirt. Another thing worth mentioning about the exploration. It kind of borrows the structure of Metroid Prime in the sense that you'll find these inaccessible areas that you'll have to return to later because you can only access them once you obtain certain upgrades or abilities. This means there will be lots and lots of backtracking. I don't particularly mind this, but if I were to do it again, I would have progressed deeper into the story to get some of those upgrades before going too hard into exploring the side areas. One last and final spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about the end of the game now, so here we go. The game was chugging along and I was pretty hooked. I was having fun, I was exploring every area I could on the map, I chipped away at the main storyline, as well as the side missions and optional challenges. I was getting important upgrades at a semi-frequent quip, and I even spent a little time gardening or requesting just the right track from the DJ at the saloon. After I logged about 30 hours, I decided I was ready to focus on the main storyline and finish the game as it felt like the narrative was reaching a climax. For the vast majority of the game, there are 2 main antagonists, Dagan Gera, the big bad, and Ravis, the muscle. I reached the point late in the game where I was hunting them down and preparing to face them in what I assumed would be a big showdown. I got to Ravis, got to the end of the second phase of the fight, fully expecting an epic third phase, but suddenly he yielded and the fight was over.
I yield.
It wasn't the easiest boss fight in the game, but it certainly wasn't the hardest. That award goes to Rick, the door technician.
Get ready to die!
I definitely struggled against some of the previous boss encounters, so I was caught off guard when the Ravis fight ended without too much resistance. Maybe I happen to have leveled up the right abilities and used the optimal stances for this particular fight, I don't know. All I know is that he was easier to handle than some of the optional side bosses, and he was certainly less challenging than that bastard spawn of Ogdo. This is all to say that the weight of this major moment in the storyline was undercut by its relatively lightweight gameplay counterpart. I imagine this is a difficult thing to get right in these narrative-heavy games, and it was still kind of fun, so it wasn't really a big deal, even though it felt like a bit of a letdown. I shrugged it off and thought, well, it's probably not supposed to be that hard because the real boss fight is going to be against Dagan Gera, the big bad. So next I ascended the Mountain Observatory, a location that was high up in the sky and definitely had a final boss area kind of vibe, which in retrospect was likely designed to set up the eventual big plot twist. I approached the fight with Dagon, ready for a satisfying conclusion to the story narrative, as well as a challenging but fair final duel. I fought Dagon, and while it wasn't as easy as the Ravus fight, it also wasn't a particularly challenging fight. Not nearly as challenging as that bastard spawn of Ogdo. And again, it was kind of a letdown. Something wasn't right. My heart sank as I realized that this was not the end of the game, and there would potentially be hours more, which there was. On top of that, they revealed a big plot twist, one that I previously thought seemed so obvious that I assumed it was not gonna happen. So throughout the game, you're assisted by a guy named Bode, Cal's new best friend and sidekick. I don't know why I said best friend, he's just his friend, but best friend sounds better. Bode seems like a good guy, or at least he would if he wasn't suspiciously distant throughout the entire game.
Bode? May the Force be with you.
You're a great fighter, Cal. Let's see how well you fly.
Oh. Talking a little shit, huh? Bode was always singularly focused on his daughter and never mustered up much enthusiasm for the greater cause.
Oh, this has been a great first date and all, but I still haven't gotten paid.
He seemed like the exact type of guy who would change loyalties as long as he thought it was in his daughter's best interest. Well, you'd never guess, but it turns out that Bode was actually a bad guy.
Oh my god!
I actually don't hate this twist per se, it's fine. Predictable, yes, but it makes sense to have some personal betrayal and intrigue to amp up the emotions for our protagonist during the climax of the story. The issue is that it really seemed like things were wrapping up, and after 30 hours of playtime, I felt pretty good about it being done soon. I had mentally prepared and was ready to get to the end of the game, but now the rug had been pulled and there was a whole nother section of the game to play. This is probably on me a little bit for having that kind of mentality, but I truly did feel like I was riding right along with the intended pace of the game for the most part. Even at this point, while I was starting to get a little frustrated, I was still enjoying the game and still had the patience to change my mindset and prepare for one last stretch of the story. Things were fine. There was a fake out ending, but now we're off to the real ending. Bode is the new big bad, and it's time to confront him and learn why he betrayed Cal and murdered Master Cordova. Except, of course, the confrontation with Bode was another fake out ending. I knew something was wrong during the fight when I noticed that I wasn't able to use my health stim. Cal gets knocked unconscious and Bode gets away. Yay, another section of the game to play. Okay, yeah, I mean, still, gotta be close to the end now, right? Can't be too much longer. Oh, we're playing as Cal's mentor now, Seer. Okay, sure, why not? Must be some kind of endgame gimmick that leads to the conclusion of the story. It's okay, I still want to know what happens next. I'm still invested in these characters, and I have to admit, despite my mild annoyance, this is still some solid writing. Everyone is distinct and well realized, and I appreciate having new and original characters to root for in the Star Wars universe. It's refreshing whenever there is a Star Wars story that doesn't rely completely on nostalgia. They almost made it through the entire story without the need to drag out a character from the original trilogy. If you played the first game, Fallen Order, you may remember that after fighting the final boss, Darth Vader shows up, forcing Cal to escape for his life. I don't think it was necessary to bring Vader into that story, but whatever, it worked fine as a way to connect the story to the original trilogy, and thankfully it's a brief encounter and you don't actually have to really fight Vader, so it doesn't distract too much from the story they were trying to tell. Fallen Order introduced a solid roster of original characters such as Cal, BD-1, Grease, Marin, and Seer, and Jedi Survivor continues their story as well as introducing some decent villains into the mix, such as Ravus, Dagon, and eventually Bode. There was no need to dust off an old ringer to spice things up. The writing throughout the game felt confident enough to not need to rely on a legacy character. But this is Star Wars, so you know they would just have to bring out someone from the canon. They brought in Darth Vader for the first game, so who did they bring in for Jedi Survivor? Darth Vader. Again. Really? Unfortunately, this is where things started to sour for me. This is where I started to have opinions. It's also important to mention that at this point in the game, the player character, Cal Kestis, has been knocked unconscious and the player is now controlling Cal's mentor and friend, Cere. So the Vader boss fight is not Cal versus Vader, it's Cere versus Vader. This leads to one of the big issues I have with this fight, which I'll get into in a minute. There's actually several things about this fight that really bothered me, so let's just break it down. Let's start with the narrative. What purpose does Darth Vader bring to this story? As I mentioned earlier, this game already went through the trouble of setting up 3 new villains to contend with. This felt sufficient in terms of bad guys in the story. Cal interacts with each of them several times throughout the game, which makes these showdowns feel personal. Bode killed one of Cal's Jedi Masters, and Cal felt rightly motivated to go get his ass and make Bode answer for his betrayal. How does Darth Vader factor into this narrative other than being a shiny piece of fan service? It's just a big distraction from what should be the climactic moment of the story. You could say that Vader represented the Empire's part in the story, and it's not too far-fetched to have him show up and lead the charge against the Hidden Path. And sure, I guess that's true in a vacuum, but come on, let's be real. Darth Vader is perhaps the single most recognizable and famous character in Star Wars. He's the big bad of the original trilogy. The entire prequel trilogy centers on Vader's upbringing. Darth Vader also shows up in Rogue One as a totally cool, super badass dude who also mass murders people. His mask shows up in the sequel trilogy just to remind you that Darth Vader was a thing even long after he died. Darth Vader usually makes an appearance in almost every Star Wars movie, video game, and TV show. He's a highly bankable superstar. Hell, if Darth Vader played in the NBA, he would unquestionably be #1 in jersey sales. My point is that if they needed to bring in a bad guy to lead the Empire in the story, couldn't they have come up with someone new, like they did with Dagan, Ravis, and Bode? Someone who isn't super distracting and comes with tons of cultural baggage? They went through all this effort to establish Bode as a traitor and a bad guy, but now he's supposed to be a bigger bad guy than Darth Vader? Besides maybe the Emperor himself, is there anybody in Star Wars that could top Darth Vader as a bad guy? It's a shitty burden to put on these newly established characters. It was only acceptable in the first game because it was a glorified QuickTime event that happened at the very end of the game. No one in Fallen Order needed to top Darth Vader, the game was over at that point. In Jedi Survivor, Vader is a pit stop toward the real end fight, which just doesn't feel right. If they wanted to put a Darth Vader fight in the game, I think it would be better served at the end of the story so it wouldn't feel like such a come down to go back to chasing Bode afterwards. But of course, they had Darth Vader arrive at the end of the first game, so they probably didn't want to do that again, and we're left with Vader being kind of awkwardly inserted into the game before the climax of the story. We also know for a fact that Vader doesn't die or get seriously hurt. I mean, he's almost late for his appearance in the next Star Wars thing.
Ah, the deep side.
So that means Vader, for all intents and purposes, is invulnerable. Meanwhile, the character player, Cere, doesn't have that kind of cachet in the Star Wars lore, so she's expendable. Any guess on how this fight turns out? I, for one, was on the edge of my seat. If they had a new character instead of Vader, the player would legitimately not know what the outcome of the fight would be, and there would be some narrative tension and intrigue. But no, Cere is defeated, and Vader is off in time to get to the ribbon cutting of a new KFC location. However, credit where credit is due, I do think that Cere's death cutscene is handled really well, and it feels like an appropriately tragic end to her character. Cere is someone we've gotten to know and like over the course of these 2 games, and she goes out in an epic yet futile fight against the Empire. I should have felt emotional at this point, right? But the reality is that I was so distracted by the appearance of Darth Vader that the story beat didn't land as hard as it could have for me. I think they still could have had an emotional death scene for Cere if she died at the hands of another Imperial villain outside of Darth Vader. I know a lot of you probably disagree with me and are probably wondering why I'm bitching and moaning so much about this. But I don't know, man. Darth Vader is such a pop culture icon that he's essentially a meme at this point, and I honestly wish he could just retire from being used in Star Wars stories from here on out. He's served a bunch of stories very well, and that's good enough. But it's just going to be diminishing returns on the emotional impact that can occur when Vader shows up again and again to go up against new characters. If you can somehow still muster up excitement for having Darth Vader show up in a Star Wars thing, I'm happy for you. When I saw Vader arrive in Jedi Survivor, I just thought, really? We're doing this again? Not great. Putting aside the story issues it brings, the actual gameplay of the Darth Vader fight has its own issues. This isn't like Fallen Order where the Vader encounter is essentially a glorified cutscene. The player actually has a full boss fight this time around. On paper, the fight is actually pretty good. Vader has an interesting and varied moveset that expands in each of the 3 phases of the fight. He's appropriately challenging, but still leaves himself vulnerable to attacks as long as you successfully dodge his attacks, particularly his grab/force choke move. It should be a decent fight and a good test for the player to execute all the moves they've learned up to this point. Except it's not, because you don't play as the character you've been leveling up, you play this section as Seer. Earlier I praised the game for giving the player different playstyle options by having different lightsaber stances and providing different force powers to choose from. During the Vader fight, however, you're forced into a specific playstyle with a fixed moveset. Seer can only use the single lightsaber stance, and only has 4 health stems available to use. At this point in the game, I had acquired 11 health stems and spent my skill points on a completely different moveset. As mentioned previously, I stuck with using the blaster and crossguard stances, and spent all of my skill points on those stances, adding to their strength and ability. I had learned how to overcome every situation using those 2 stances, and spent an ample amount of time exploring to get upgrades and make Cal stronger, theoretically to tip the odds into my favor during a challenging boss fight. And now that I got to said challenging boss fight, all those options and upgrades were thrown away and I was stuck with the single saber stance and 4 health stems. Cool. On top of that, Seer's ultimate ability is completely different from Cal's slow-mo ability. Hers is kind of a defensive force move that was useful earlier while protecting allies from the advancing Imperial forces, but it didn't seem very effective in a 1v1 scenario. I mean, maybe there's some kind of use for it that I didn't pick up on, but I found it to be not helpful at all in this fight. So yeah, I struggled quite a bit against Darth Vader using this foreign moveset. If someone else had chosen to use the single lightsaber stance throughout the game, they would presumably be more familiar and have a much easier time, but that wasn't the case for me. I lost again and again and again. I got to the point where I could handle the first 2 phases well enough, but by the time I made it to phase 3, I would always be low on health stems, leaving myself highly vulnerable during the hardest part of the fight. Expecting the player to get through a challenging 3-phase boss fight with only 4 health stems and a stripped-down moveset is asking a lot. The worst part is that mechanically, the fight is pretty fun. Learning Vader's moveset felt challenging but fair, and I could feel myself getting better as I kept going. Until phase 3 arrived, and I would inevitably die from running out of health stems as Vader dug deep into his bag of filthy tricks. If I was playing as Cal with all my upgrades, this would have probably been just the right amount of challenge. Instead, it's a massive difficulty spike and almost killed my enjoyment of the game. And I know, you could say this is a skill issue and I should just get good. And sure, that's fair. But there really wasn't any kind of ramp up to this level of challenge. The other main antagonists of the story were easy enough to take down on my first attempt. Then suddenly there's a fight that's just magnitudes harder. The balance just felt way off. After about 30 or 40 failed attempts and several hours later, I decided I'd had enough. I was invested in the story and wanted to see the ending, but I was just completely over the Darth Vader fight. I decided to just take a knee and lower the difficulty, so I could just be done with it and move on. After going from normal to easy, I took Vader down on the first attempt. To add insult to injury, after you win the fight, Seer dies in a cutscene anyway. If this was how it was going to play out, then why make the player have to win the fight at all? Why not do that thing where you give the player one shot to win the fight, and if they die early, it just triggers the cutscene where Seer gets killed and we can move on to the next story beat. Conversely, if the player is skilled enough to make it all the way through the fight, then maybe they get a special achievement or cosmetic reward or something. Forcing the player to win this fight instead just absolutely destroys the pacing of the game. The Vader appearance could have been forgiven if it was just a quick speed bump instead of a grinding halt. It was an unnecessary diversion that soured my enjoyment of an otherwise great game. After losing a whole lot of steam during the Darth Vader fight, I just wanted to get to the end. But unfortunately, the game wasn't on the same page. I've talked a bunch about the late game boss fights, but I haven't yet mentioned the waves upon waves of enemies the game throws at the player in between these boss encounters. The sequence with Seer defending the hidden path from the Imperial Walkers felt sufficiently epic and served as a cool final set piece to close out the game. But no, once the player takes control of Cal again, you have to fight an obnoxious number of enemies. There are many points in the game where they throw lots of enemies at you, so by the end of the game it wasn't really fun to do this anymore. The saving grace is that you get a new OP ultimate power, but even that overstays its welcome just because of the sheer number of enemies you have to take down. I think it would have done wonders for the pacing if they just let us get to the final boss sooner. I was frustrated to the point where I wasn't enjoying myself anymore, but not frustrated enough to give up, especially this far in. I finally got to the big confrontation with Bode, but I was long past the desire for another challenge, so I left the difficulty on easy and got through it without much of a problem. It felt like the story had several emotional peaks before this. The Ravis fight, the Dagon fight, the Bode betrayal, the Vader fight, and then finally the Bode confrontation. All of which could have been a good place to start to wrap the story up. It felt like the game was going to end about 3 or 4 hours earlier than it did, so I was getting impatient by the time it ended. Putting my mood aside, however, the story wrapped up in a serviceably satisfying manner while also leaving our hero in a good place to, quote, finish the fight in an event of another sequel. Despite my rant about Jedi Survivor dropping the ball at the end, I still enjoyed the game and will probably be ready to play a sequel a few years down the road if it happens. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have that strong of an opinion about the way the game ended if the devs didn't blow up all their built-up goodwill on a Darth Vader cameo that undercut the importance of all the new characters introduced in the Star Wars Jedi games. One of the reasons I liked the show Andor so much was because it felt like its own thing. It respected the rules and world building of Star Wars, but it had its own characters with their own stories. The show was confident enough in its storytelling it didn't need Darth Vader, or Yoda, or Han Solo, or Chewbacca, or Princess Leia, or any of those old ringers to sweep in and save the story. Thank you, Tony Gilroy. Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor are similarly refreshing and do their own thing too. But wedging a big name brand legacy character into the climax of the story just cheapened the whole thing. To me, it felt like dangling a shiny object in front of a cat. I'm aware that many Star Wars fans don't mind this kind of fan service and probably disagree with me. I'm sure there are less curmudgeonly people out there who squealed with delight when Darth Vader walked on screen. And you know, good for them. I almost wish I could muster up that kind of joy for a Darthy Darth cameo, because the Star Wars franchise tends to lean heavily into that kind of fan service. Unfortunately, the oversaturation of the Star Wars brand since Disney took over has all but extinguished my enthusiasm for everyone's favorite galaxy far, far away. The only Star Wars projects that pique my interest these days are the ones that try to create their own path away from the iconic characters. Jedi Survivor still largely falls into that category and represents the light side of modern Star Wars canon. I also want to acknowledge and emphasize the medium in which this story is told. This is a video game. And unlike movies and TV shows, the experience can vary widely from person to person. Each player makes different choices about when to follow the main story and when to go off and do side stuff. Different people prefer different difficulties. People who played on the easiest story mode might have felt that the pacing was perfect. Maybe more skilled players had no problem with the Vader fight and breezed through it without giving it too much thought. This video is a reflection of my personal experience, and I might be in the minority as someone who chafed against the end of the game so much. When it comes down to it though, Jedi Survivor is a really good game that I would still recommend.
Repeat, you're breaking up. Damn it.
He just damn it, and as he gets murdered. It's amazing. I spent so much time harping on the story and the ending that I don't know if I emphasized enough how fun it is to play for the vast majority of the time. However, the main reason I made this video is because I was frustrated how close the game was to being truly great. Until this franchise has the confidence to stop worrying about the needless fan service, I fear it will never reach its full potential. And there you have it. Thanks for watching the video and taking the time to listen to what I have to say. I know it's a bit of a minefield to talk about Star Wars on the internet, but hey, I did it anyway. Feel free to check out the other videos I have. I have a few other reviews on Titanfall 2, Doom, Zelda, that kind of stuff. And I also do some live streaming on Twitch, so check me out over there. Smell you later.